Here is Colorverse Photo Black, and I'm calling this a gray because that is the color intended, not obvious by the name. There is no tone shift as paper changes, and it does shade, but the real standout quality of this ink is the permanence, which is obvious when looking at either the swatch or the chromatography. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs as it's right up there as it is on the premium paper. It's really good. Now, I enjoy gray tone, kind of more to be a pencil gray, but combined with the permanence, I love this ink. The idea of seeing someone trying to erase it just makes me laugh. So I would love a bottle of this ink.
The pen for today is a Lamy All-Star. So now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we see a fantastic pencil gray tone that if I was using a finer nib, it might look as if it actually was pencil. There's no feather, there is no spread, there is some shading, and you can see it show up fairly well, I think better on like membership here, where the M has darker and lighter tones. And same with the E, darker and lighter. Second M, lighter and darker. B, lighter and darker. Regular lighter and darker tones in each letter, making this really look very nice. Stands out super well on this very bright white paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Saturn V. Here is Colorverse Einstein Ring.
Here is Colorverse Laurel. Here is Colorverse Deep Purple.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter Notebook.
Here we see the same tone as the Clairfontaine, beautiful pencil gray in tone with no feathering, with no spread, with shading. Take a look at the example on the second line, where the E is darker than the X that got is lighter than the X that got quite a bit darker. The AM lighten up a little bit. That P goes to a nice mid-tone with an LE dark at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, and the tone of the ink is not altered by the tone of the paper underneath, meaning even though this is a lighter gray ink, it is opaque in that it is not being altered by the tone of paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against this quad rule, which I was a little bit concerned about being a pencil gray. The quad rule really does get to blend into the background, making this a great ink to use if this is the type of paper you use. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more gray inks that you can find the reviews of on this channel.
Here is Diatramentis Charles Dickens Cement Gray. Here is Diamine Moondust.
Here is Pelican Edelstein Moonstone. Here is Van Diemen's Eclipse.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade nearly as frequently as the Clairfontaine. If you are a student using this, use a finer nib and it's going to look like you're writing in pencil and no one will be the wiser. Plus, the permanence is really going to add to its usefulness in lab notes. Stands out against the quad rule without any kind of problem. What a great choice. If you're a student, keep this one up. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Geherbon Bleu Provence. Here is Sailor Zodiac Aries. Here is Noodler's Army. Here is Van Diemen's Beetroot Relish.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, but it does noticeably spread. The spread could be a little bit of a problem. Perhaps a drier, finer pen would be the option here to make this the most usable. Still expect a little bit of spread there because copy paper does tend to have a little bit of spread. There's a few moments of shading that do occur, though it is not its standout quality. Again, the real standout quality is that pencil gray and its permanence. Looking at the back of the page, there's a few spots where it does get deeper into the page. It is copy paper after all. There's no problem for ghosting. I do believe that if this is what you're using, you could comfortably write on the back of the page.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Lamy All-Star Broad is writing dry and gives a decent gray with bits of shading. Off camera, I tried it in a wet fine and it darkened it a little bit to about a 4B pencil, and the shading was about the same. For me, I go for a dry pen of any nib size for a nice gray tone that really could always come with some extreme resistance. Now, I say it'll work well for any nib size. Me, yes, I'd go any nib, but I think a fine or an extra fine really does push the it looks like pencil quality.